Hey, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our Manufacturing Financial Executive Roundtable titled Supply Chain Challenges or Opportunities. As we visit with our clients and business partners, this has been one of the biggest pain points that companies are dealing with, along with the pandemic challenges and labor challenges. So we hope that you'll have some helpful takeaways from this session. My name is Wes Beam. I'll be your moderator today. I lead our manufacturing and distribution practice here at Gilmore. And this roundtable is sponsored by the Ohio Manufacturing Extension Partnership and SIFT. Hopefully everyone's heard of the Ohio MEP. They help Ohio's small and medium-sized manufacturers to increase sales, create jobs, and generate cost savings through technological innovation, workforce training, and improved management practices. I've had the pleasure to work with Troy Wildermuth, the Director of Manufacturing, and his team has been helpful in offering ideas and also helping funding for our clients. If you'd like to find out more about the MEP, please contact me and I will get you in touch with their team. A couple housekeeping items. There's going to be a panel discussion today, and we really encourage questions and interactive discussion. So if you have a comment, a story, or a question, please click on that questions icon, enter your question, and click send. I'll be monitoring throughout the presentation. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. If you need any CPE credit, please email us at info@gjmltd.com, and we'll go ahead and get you a certificate. Our panel today is two gentlemen from RSM Supply Chain Services Group, David Cohn and Bart Huthwaite, and Andy Risner, who is the Director of Procurement and Global Supply Chain Management at Romark in Findlay, Ohio. But first, I would like to introduce one of my partners, Bob Bobeck, who's going to give you an update on the second round of the PPP, the employee retention credit changes, and a little bit on the new stimulus law. I think he read all 5,000 pages and he gets about 5 to 10 minutes here to give us a quick summary. So good luck, Bob, and welcome.
Thank you, Wes. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it was about a year ago. I think I keep on reading that the state of Ohio announced that we were having some first cases of the COVID-19 virus and they were shutting down businesses. And as part of that, they had started some programs to the SBA, the EDA loans, and then shortly thereafter, on March 27th of last year, they announced the PPP program. And it's been kind of crazy ride to the last year of getting here. And there's been a lot of changes to this program throughout the last year. And I just want to get you updated on the most recent changes. So at the end of December of 2020, they created a second draw PPP program. They had funded $285 billion of money towards this program. And as of March 7th, only $165 billion was committed. So that means there's still $120 billion available. Right now, this program expires March 31st of 2021. And so most banks are closing their portals earlier to make sure they get all the underwriting done. We've seen a much more rigorous underwriting of these loans, so it does take a little more time. So if you want to do it, you got to do it soon. They also did reopen round one loans. So we have some clients that back in 2020 were not hit initially by the pandemic. And so they chose not to get a round one loan. Now they can go back and get one if they have the uncertainty today. And again, the requirements real quick for the round two loans is you have to show a 25% reduction in revenue and in a quarter of 2020 as compared to the same quarter in 19, and then less than 300 employees. And the law that was just passed this week provided another $7.2 billion for the PPP, but they did not initially change the expiration of March 31st. I think that's going to change. There's a lot of money expected to be left over. Also in the law in December 2020, they now allow PPP participants to also use the employee retention credit. Prior to that, you had to choose. Now you can use both. And if you do qualify for 2020, and go back and amend your payroll tax returns and claim this credit. It is a credit that's calculated based upon wages and health insurance. So you can't use the same cost that you used for PPP loan forgiveness in 2020 and get this ERC credit, but you should be able to qualify for both. Most companies are. In 2020, the maximum amount you could get is $5,000 per employee. In 2021, and which was changed in the December law, this extended the program initially through June 30th, and it was $7,000 per quarter in 2021. There are different eligibility rules for 2020 and 2021. So if you want to learn more about that, please reach out to us. And then the new law that was just passed this week extended this program now through December 31st of 2021. So you get 4 quarters of this year. Last couple of things that are in this package is $28.6 billion for hard hit food services. This is called the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. $15 billion targeted for business seeking these EATL grants. So those have been opened back up. Those are $10,000 per business. $1.25 billion for shuttered venue operators. These are all your small, you know, like the Stranahan here in town or the Fox Theater up in Detroit, your small theaters and stuff like that. Also, they allow these shuttered venue operators now to participate both in PPP and this program. And then finally, there's $350 billion aid to state and local governments, $170 billion for funding K through college universities, and another $165 billion for COVID-19 funding. This is really healthcare related and making sure there's enough money for to get the vaccines out. I know that's rolling out much more quicker right now. And the last thing here is $41 billion in emergency rental assistance. Again, there's a moratorium on evictions. And so this is money going into the system to help those tenants pay their rent. So I know there was a lot there. If you have any questions, please reach out to us and we can help you better understand or answer your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Like you said, if you have any questions, you know, we're certainly here to help. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So now I'd like to formally introduce our 3 panelists today. First is David Cohn. David's a principal at RSM. He's the national leader of the operations and supply chain practice. As a manufacturing and consulting executive with more than 30 years of leadership experience in operations, supply chain, and ERP, David has spent his career helping clients address and execute key initiatives around strategy, operations, and technology projects as part of their transformational efforts. David is out of the Chicago office. We also have Bart Huthwaite. Bart is a principal at RSM in their strategy and management consulting practice. He has extensive supply chain operations and business transformation consulting experience across the value chain. He is both analytically driven and entrepreneurial, with a proven track record for building strong client relationships and providing insights that solve complex business problems and drive real business value. Bart's out of the Detroit office. And third, we have Andy Risner. Andy is the Director of Procurement and Global Supply Chain Management at Romark. He is responsible for the company's global sourcing, supply chain planning, logistics, and intercompany ordering functions. He has 20 years of diversified supply chain and procurement experience in the automotive, consumer packaging, and electronics industries. So now that we have the panelists' backgrounds, I'll turn it over to you, David, to get the conversation started, and thanks for being here.
Great, thank you, Wes. Appreciate the introduction, and hello, everybody. Welcome to our discussion today on supply chain, what leaders are doing and how they're preparing for an uncertain future. We're gonna run through some slides here. The goal is to have a little bit of panel discussion across Bart, Andy, and myself. And we've taken some input from you previously in some of the survey information that we've got. And as Wes pointed out, if you have other questions, please bring them in and we'll try and bring them into the discussion. With that, Bart, maybe we can just go to a quick overview. Wanted to introduce you to RSM for those of you who may or may not be familiar with our business. We are the 5th largest audit, tax, and consulting firm in the US. and we bring a very, I guess, client-centric middle market approach to the table. So we're happy to be here today. Bart, if you could go to the next slide, please. We are global, and in today's environment and some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today, global certainly has a significant impact on supply chain, COVID, and how all of us are responding to the demands out there from our customers all the way through the rest of the supply chain. Bart? So, it's interesting, maybe to set the table for a discussion today. Disruptions in the supply chain has been a hot topic for a long time. We all know what happened almost a year ago. It's been in the news lately. We're coming up on 1 year of this big disruption called COVID. But disruptions to the supply chain aren't necessarily new. And we've got a couple of examples we'll speak to a little bit later. But these are sometimes big events, sometimes isolated local events. They can be severe and impact the entire world, like COVID, or they can be localized and affect only one country or even one city within one country, depending on the type of impact that's going on. One of the things that I think people aren't maybe aware of are some of these data points here along the bottom of the slide, that the frequencies of these disruptions, while it seems like it's more frequent than every 4 years or 3.5 years, they seem to be becoming more and more severe as our global supply chains are more tightly linked and more interdependent than ever. And they have a real impact in terms of profitability or profit loss. 42% impact worth of EBITDA over a course of 10 years. It's not an insignificant event, as many of our clients can attest to the last year of trying to fight through COVID and the global supply chain impacts it's had. But I think the takeaway here, and Bart and Andy will talk a little bit more about this, is we're all vulnerable. And what are we doing about those vulnerabilities? What are we doing about that exposure? How do we mitigate and plan for and address those risks? So, when we think about that, Bart, what would be a useful framework? Maybe you could take us through the next couple slides. You're on mute, Bart. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Absolutely, David. Thank you. So in terms of a framework, when we think about enterprise risk management, there's essentially 5 categories: operational, financial, strategic, regulatory, and the all-important and unforeseeable. Today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the operational and the unforeseeable, but these are, the categories that our clients are very much focused on. And from an operational standpoint, a lot of us have experienced the supply disruptions. There's a lot of focus on trying to improve demand planning and get better forecast accuracy. Quality has been a long time operational focus, of course, but through the downturn, the Great Recession, we learned the importance of supplier financial health and the impacts that can have on the entire value chain. Of course, we're all focused on the war on talent these days and labor availability. Cyber seems to be becoming more and more prevalent, unfortunately. So that's definitely taken a bigger position in the overall kind of risk management framework. Financial, of course, it's all the stuff you guys have been dealing with for years and years. Currencies, commodity prices, general economic trends, fraud, so on. Strategic, there's a lot of folks that have really been negatively impacted because of the business model they have. Some are unavoidable. Restaurants with their brick and mortar restaurants, they're trying to go to more on-demand delivery and whatnot. So there's definitely risks in how you operate your strategy and how you compete against others. Regulatory, of course, unavoidable, but certainly we should be thinking about them and planning around them, thinking about the tax-effective supply chains, for instance. And then, of course, the unforeseeable, the anomalous events that have material impacts on your overall value chain, be it natural disasters like we've seen recently in Japan with earthquakes, and before with Fukushima, and global pandemics, of course, that we're dealing with now. Of course, Dallas just experienced some very severe weather that had a material impact on the overall economy and broader supply chain. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical, socio-economic, and civil unrest in general. So again, I said we're going to focus today more on the unforeseeable and operational. But before I do that, I wanted to take you through some of the results we got from the survey that we sent out. So as we think about that economic outlook and the financial risks, the good news is that a vast majority of the participants here today are feeling optimistic. 74% are either somewhat more optimistic or significantly more optimistic. And the good news that there was 0% that were significantly less optimistic or more pessimistic, I should say. So it sounds like there's a lot of alignment that good times are in the future. In terms of what the greatest concerns are over the next 12 months, this was an interesting spread, I thought. Demand uncertainty is certainly in there. Supply shortages, we've all been dealing with it. There's been a lot of prolonged issues related to COVID. Of course, there's a lot of concern about new regs coming down the road. Nobody thought there would be nobody foresees another black swan event, which is, I guess, a positive thing. But labor, the war on talent is, on in full force, and we're hearing that across all of our clients. So that's a very, big area that I think will continue to be a focus in the near and midterm future, for sure. And then in terms of looking back on the COVID experience, what we asked the participants, we asked you, what you wish you had more of. And 50% said better visibility into both supply and demand, which I thought was interesting. And then we did a double click on that, and it was really demand. Given the COVID situation, I would have expected a higher response around the supply. Really, where are my ships? Where are my containers? When will I get my parts? But of course, that the demand was completely upset, and so using historic data became very problematic. So obviously a big area of opportunity and a lot of focus. And today we're going to talk to Andy, get some of his experience of how he dealt with both of those situations through the COVID situation. And then we're going to share some stories from our other clients as well in terms of how they're starting to tackle some of these issues. So this outlines, and you'll get a copy of this deck. We're not going to walk through this in detail, but this sets up a very high-level approach to how you might prepare your supply chain for more resilience. Of course, it's analyzing your current supply chain and understanding how it operates, understanding all of the bottlenecks, efficiencies, the flow, and all of that. And then it's really about anticipating those areas that can be easily exposed. And that's where I think a lot of work is really taking place. There's a lot of our clients are starting to implement more predictive analytics to try to address that demand uncertainty, looking at external variables to include in their forecast models, be it unemployment, be it fuel prices, whatever, but more than just historical performance to predict future performance. And then there is a lot of activity taking a look at how our clients can make their supply chains more resilient. There's a lot of clients looking at their footprints and inventory, big balance between efficiency and risk. A lot of folks have really swung the pendulum to the extreme on efficiency and just in time and minimizing inventories and going to low labor cost countries and the like. And in some of those instances, they've been burned. And so they're starting to reevaluate a lot of that and whether or not single sourcing is the right answer. Perhaps there's dual sourcing required. Maybe we need to think about other distribution centers and the like. But I wanted to get Andy's perspective. When we talked yesterday, it was clear that he didn't necessarily follow this exact approach as he prepared for the COVID situation. So with that, Andy, I'd love to hear how you guys tackled this situation at Romark.
Yeah, thanks. And for us, 2020 was a very challenging year. We had started on a network rationalization, footprint rationalization plan. So amongst all this pandemic, we were moving around our distribution centers and realigning based on our customer demand. So when the pandemic hit, everybody kind of froze and everybody jumps into action mode, right? So some of the analytics and things that we had historically maybe done a little bit of, everybody kind of wanted to jump into the action, and we jumped right to the execute stage. So it's, hey, we have a customer order of X, and we started to believe that was going to be, we were so optimistic and hoping we saw a trend that we were very quick to pivot. And on many products, we probably overshot the runway. So we have two parts of our business. We manufacture some goods, which we can adjust internally and much quicker reaction due to lead times. And then a lot of our products come from Asia. Typically some of our personalization items that, might be sold to a customer that supplies on Etsy and things like that. Those customers are much harder to predict and much harder to pick up on a trend. So yeah, we had some situations where we decided, all right, we need to react. We need to expedite some shipments in order to support top line sales. And at that point in time, there weren't a lot of airliner, a lot of Delta flights going back and forth from Detroit to China. So it was a particularly difficult decision because, air freight costs were 5x. So air freight is never an easy decision anyway, and it's always a premium cost. And even during the pandemic, it was an even tougher one. But we tried to jump into execution mode and start bailing water as quickly as we could.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate the you sharing your experience. I thought this was interesting and timely. In this week's automotive news, there was 4 different articles, I think it was 4 in total, that covered kind of the lessons learned from 2011 in Japan, the tsunami. And it was interesting. There was a couple examples here on the left. One is Toyota, the other is Ford, where they actually did take the opportunity to not only try to contain the situation, but better prepare to manage situations like this in the future. For instance, Toyota spent an inordinate amount of time and money. If I'm not mistaken, they partnered with MIT to develop a much better understanding of the tier N. So beyond just tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, they tried to get down to tier 4. In some cases, however, they took it down to tier 10, because it's those suppliers, as we're learning with microchips, for instance, that can impact multiple higher level suppliers and ultimately impact the OEMs. So there's a lot of effort being spent trying to improve that tier N visibility. It's a really hard problem. I've personally spent some time working on that, and I think it's going to take some type of consortium that provides that visibility across industries, but it's certainly a problem. Ford, on the other hand, they also spent a lot of time and energy focusing on supplier financial health. That was a big issue back in the Great Recession. And then during Fukushima, they took those lessons and built on them. They've actually built a very robust supplier risk management technology solution that's predictive in nature and looks across different variables such as quality, on-time delivery, financial health of the supplier, geopolitical uncertainty, and so on. So there's a couple examples where companies did double down and actually put the processes and technologies in place to truly try to anticipate risk. Another one, for example, Toyota built up 10 months worth of microchip inventory. So they saw that constraint coming down the road. They have not had to stop production, whereas others have. So we'll get into inventory strategies as well. But the reason I bring this up is because of this last article, how a good crisis went to waste. And that really talked about the fact that while it's nice to talk about improving resiliency, it always comes at a cost. And after these other disruptions, in many cases, suppliers went back to business as usual. And so what we wanted to talk to you about are, what are our clients doing that aren't necessarily adding significant costs to their operations, in some case reducing costs to their operations, but just implementing practices that will ultimately help them better prepare for these situations in the future. It's not all about investing in whiz-bang technology to help you anticipate risk. It's also having the processes and the communication channels and the relationships in place to be agile enough to deal with the supply chain disruptions. So that's what we'd like to talk to you about now, is what we're seeing happening in the market, with our clients as we work with them. First and foremost, there's been a big focus on improving organizational alignment and communications. What do I mean by that? Well, the first acronym here, Sales and Operations Planning, or S&OP, also goes by the name of Single Integrated Operating Plan. Some of you might know it as Integrated Business Planning. In essence, It's trying to get the right hand of the company to talk more effectively with the left hand of the company. In other words, sales and operations, trying to work together cross-functionally to align supply with demand, an agreed to consensus-based demand, in a way that achieves financial results. Now, this is a very scalable process. I don't want this to come across as an overly bureaucratic, time-consuming process, because I know a lot of the companies joining us today are not large and are lean, and folks wear a lot of different hats. At the end of the day, this process, again, is about improving communication cross-functionally to better align supply with demand. In some companies, that can be a very rigorous weekly, monthly, quarterly process enabled by all kinds of technology, forecasts, and what have you. In other situations, maybe it's a weekly and monthly meeting, quarterly meeting with a few folks, cross-functional folks at your company. But I can't emphasize that enough, the importance of truly aligning the organization around one operating plan based on the financial objectives that you've set, based on what the sales is hearing from customers, what you expect to deliver, and so on. Get aligned so that everybody's pulling the oars in the same direction. Andy talked a little bit about network rationalization. We're talking to clients, there's always looking for opportunities to save costs, perhaps reducing the number of distribution centers or warehouses. In other instances, we're in conversations where I should have called this network optimization, because there's discussions happening to open up new distribution centers to reduce that risk and exposure. And I know, Andy, you worked on that. Was there anything more you wanted to share around your network rationalization effort?
Yeah, network rationalization. We've got tens of thousands of customers throughout the country, and we've grown both organically and through acquisition. And we really looked at, hey, it was a time we had very small DCs in remote parts of the country that we just inherited. So we really took the last 2 years to kind of align our footprint with where our customers are, right? So our goal was shipping costs increase each year, and service levels are important, right? So you take that coupled with the Amazon effect. People want it, they want it in 2 days, and they don't want it to come in 3 different shipments, and we don't want to pay for split ship. So shipping costs are a very big part of our business, and we really spent the last 2 years trying to get our arms around it, getting the right size of locations and in the right spot in the country where it makes the most sense given our customer footprint, to be able to support, the next step is the demand planning and optimization and forecasting. Yeah,
and just to add on to the network conversation, so we recently completed an engagement with a client who, there's great tools out there that we help them leverage to better identify which customers should be supplied out of which warehouses. It was surprising once we got in there and did the analysis, how many efficiencies were available to not only reduce costs, but improve service levels for the customers. So that's a lot, we're focusing there a lot as well. As Andy was starting to lead into, however, another big focus is around demand planning and forecasting. Given the uncertainty, the fact that historic models don't always predict the future when you have these huge anomalous events like an earthquake or a global pandemic, what have you, there's a lot of effort being placed on improving demand planning. It's a journey, and if you haven't started, leveraging more statistical forecasts, start the journey, because it's going to be an evolution. And I've worked with very mature clients where we've developed econometric models that took into account all kinds of external variables, to more basic, simple models taking into account just historic sales and the input of the sales team. That's really important, I think. Make sure that communication, going back to the sales and operations planning, it's not just the analytical forecast, it's reviewing that forecast with sales to make sure everyone's aligned to get to that consensus-based forecast that you're going to plan your operations around. Andy, did you have any comments that you wanted to share in terms of your demand planning efforts?
Yeah, so really we started with network rationalization, and our next step in the supply chain journey was getting our arms around a demand plan, tool, system, process. This pandemic has helped accelerate that a little bit, right? Because we have many different categories we supply, everything from an acrylic sheet to a $15,000 printer to a coffee mug to sublimatable socks. We have a lot of different demand profiles and customers with all of their own different sets of challenges and opportunities. And really we realized, we used a historical look back average model, right? So looking back 6 months, taking the average doesn't always capture, trends either up or trends down. So we are implementing a kind of a blend of SNOP, SIOP, IBP, we're calling it IBR, but really it will facilitate that cross-functional discussion, right? So in today's environment, I can't support sales growth if I don't know that it's coming. And even if I do know that it's coming, I'm not necessarily sure I can get it here in time, right? So it's the ability to recognize a trend and everybody agree that it's a trend versus a one-time outlier, and our ability to react within lead time and plan for it.
Excellent, thanks, Andy. So the big building blocks of SNOP, or whatever you want to call it, are really demand planning and supply planning. Again, it's all about aligning supply with demand. So there's a lot of activity taking place in supply planning as well. We've talked to a lot of clients who are revisiting their sourcing strategy. Again, I mentioned that a lot of folks over-indexed into Asia, and that's caused all kinds of problems with the disrupted shipping, the lack of containers being strewn all over the world, and what have you. So there's a lot of conversation about thinking about dual sourcing strategies or more regional based sourcing strategies, getting closer to your customers and what have you. But again, that's a balance. That does not come without a cost. And the question is that cost going to be able to be passed on to customers or not? So there is absolutely the desire to become more resilient in your sourcing strategy. The question is, can you afford to do so? So that's not an easy decision. A lot of our clients are starting to improve how they look at the costs during sourcing. For instance, not just looking at piece price, transportation, but really taking a more holistic view of sourcing and cost, looking at total landed cost, taking into account some of the customs, duties, taxes, perhaps some of the risks of being so far away from your customers and whatnot. So while the cost may come back as the primary objective to solve for, I think there is a lot of discussion and a broadening of the aperture during the sourcing discussions, and which I think is really important. Operational visibility. There's a lot of effort underway here, really trying to get better insight into inventory levels, both raw materials, WIP, finished goods, and so on. Capacity planning. How can we do more with the equipment we have and the limited resources we have? As well as the assets, trying to maximize that throughput. There's a lot of technology that's coming online these days, and a lot of discussions about manufacturing 4.0, the industrial Internet of Things. In the middle market, we're seeing not a rush to that, but we are absolutely seeing companies tiptoeing towards that future reality and starting to take a look at technologies that can help them improve the visibility into their operations. More recently, we've been doing a ton of work around inventory. Given the scarcity of raw materials and supply, really focusing on those critical SKUs. What are those high priorities, those A's and B's, high priority SKUs, to make sure that you have available raw materials and capacity to produce those to meet demand. And so we've seen a lot of our clients go through SKU rationalization efforts and really trying to become a lot more mature in terms of their inventory planning. Really starting to take into account the variability of demand through the correlation of variance, taking that into account with the overall volume, but coming up with strategies, not blanket strategies across all of the inventory, but truly segregating their inventory and coming up with policies and procedures to ensure that they're minimizing those stockouts, not shutting their customers' lines down, and really can continue to fulfill those high priority customers. And maybe there's trade-offs that need to be made using raw materials for more high priority customers. So a lot of focus on inventory management these days. Supplier relationship management. There was an interesting story or conversation I had recently with the owner of a company. They make different aftermarket products for auto parts stores, be it like brake cleaner, aerosol cans, and things like that. And this gentleman was struggling with where to find aluminum cans. He just couldn't get supply. I mean, he went from 1 month turnaround times to 10-month turnaround times. So he scoured the earth looking for new suppliers that he could bring on board to source aluminum cans. In reality, however, their customers, the other suppliers' customers needed the supply as well. And his comments to me were, it's tough to to build a relationship during a crisis. So they just weren't willing to enter into new contracts with new customers because they didn't have the supply. They were trying to take care of their existing customers. So it's important that when you have good suppliers, you work well with them, you treat them well. And if you want to, consider dual sourcing, then, think about that as well. The supplier risk management or third-party risk management is where, that gets back to the Toyota and Ford examples I mentioned earlier. Building tools to improve the insight into things like on-time delivery, quality, the financial health, as I mentioned, of suppliers, and there's services that can provide that information to you. There's companies having people monitor geopolitical events to keep track of those anomalous events that may impact a value chain. So there is a lot of work going on there. One of the challenges there, as I mentioned before, is getting that tier N visibility. It's one thing to understand, the health across multiple attributes for your tier 1 suppliers. It's quite another to understand how the fourth tier is going to impact them. Advanced analytics, I think we're all focused on that, trying to leverage it more and more across the 3 different areas of dashboards through descriptive analytics, leveraging more predictive analytics from a forecasting standpoint, especially. Really, the aspiration is migrating to that prescriptive world, and that really jumps down to that last thing, the control tower. If you're not familiar with control towers, and I'll come back to the scenario planning, but control towers is kind of that nirvana vision where you have insight and visibility to the entire end-to-end supply chain. You know where your raw materials are, you know where it's at in transportation, you know what you have in inventory, and so on and so forth, as well as all of the demand that you have coming in. But the control tower, the ultimate, is not only just having that visibility, but putting in automation, leveraging prescriptive analytics to actually have hands-off supply chain planning. We're a ways away, but there is a ton of technology that's focused on that. A lot of companies trying to solve for that. And I think we're only going to see improvements in the supply chain visibility moving forward. Just circling back to that last one, simulation, scenario planning, there's a lot of tools coming out as well to take a look at scenario planning, from enablers to enabling the S&OP process, helping you run through different scenarios, planning scenarios quickly to make sure that you're making fact-based decisions in a very short time. And then simulation, we're seeing a lot of clients leverage simulation tools on the plant floor to try to improve their efficiency and throughput as well. So these are, a lot of what our clients are doing. David, I'm sorry I skipped over one. I know you had an example around the supplier risk management. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear that as well, please.
Well, I think on the topic, thanks, Bart. I think on the topic of, COVID disruptions, we had a particular client that about a year ago, maybe a little after that, they saw a significant uptick in their business. And what they asked us to come and take a look at is the resiliency of their current supply base from a supplier relationship, and also a geopolitical risk. One of the things that, for those of us who have international connections with a number of our suppliers, that inbound geopolitical risk, Bart talked a little bit about the challenges Long Beach and all the other ports in terms of getting our product through. This particular client had a very strong and in-place strategy to mitigate the supply fluctuations in their business, and really asked us to expand that, very much like what Andy was talking about, he started, which is that network optimization. Do I have the right sources of supply in the right places with the right capabilities? And do I have the relationships in place so I can dial it up or dial it down within service level requirements of my business? And as you talked about, Bart, everybody's going to scale this based on their business and their capacity. This client was very well structured, very well prepared for that big increase in their business, and they took advantage of it because, again, they had all the pieces in place across their supply network that when their opportunity hit, 40% increase in their business, and they actually were able to take that and expand it because they were taking market share from some less prepared competitors. So it has a real impact when you are ahead of the curve, and Andy and his team were ahead and even still trying to, be ahead and take advantage of that. Andy, I don't know how you want to describe or if you want to augment anything there, but even your best laid plans still left you with a lot of challenges, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just having the data available, and everybody, we have a lot of, during a time like this, there's a lot of emotions flowing around, right? And certain people are very passionate about what they think should happen, but I think it's important to get a team consensus, and we align as one number, one objective as a team, and that's what we move forward with. So getting the network right is everybody agreed that that's where we need to go, but then plans change, right? We halted construction on our largest DC when the pandemic hit, right? So then you've got inbound containers going to the wrong place, and you can't call and cancel the pizza when it's already on its way, right? So being able to adjust kind of midstream, and maybe it's not optimal, but being able to kind of audible it on the line of scrimmage, and plans change as long as everybody's aligned and they know what that plan is. And we don't always like the outcome, but if we know what we're doing and we hold hands, it'll be a much better outcome than if it's a one voice.
Thanks for the additional input. Back to you, Bart.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate that. Wes, that's essentially the content that we had to cover, and we would welcome any questions anybody has at this time.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here. So the first one, maybe a little bit of a loaded question, but curious to get your guys' opinion. The question was, labor and talent is such a big part of supply chain. What do you guys think is driving this war on talent? Is it our educational system? Is it generational? Is it social stigma? Kind of capitalistic achievement? What are some of your thoughts on what's driving this war on talent?
I think it's a lot of those things personally. There's a lot of, our economy has changed. Back in the day, manufacturing jobs, a lot of people migrated to the Midwest for those jobs. They were seen as tremendous opportunities to, earn a good wage and have a good lifestyle, and, take care of your family, and, have a cottage up north, and all of that. And our economy has changed. It used to be heavily focused on manufacturing. We're much more of a service economy now. It's still hard working in a distribution center. That is it harder or easier than a manufacturing center or in a retail setting? So I think the diversity of choice that young people have today in terms of the career opportunities is certainly one of those factors. And manufacturing work is hard work. And so now you're getting into generational things that I'm not going to touch with a 10-foot pole, but it's just, not as attractive as broadly attractive as I'll say as it has been in the past. That would be one comment I would make. David, Andy, any other thoughts?
No, I would agree with that. You have that kind of normal trend, and then when you're in the situation with pandemic and unemployment benefits, you're competing with some different challenges as well, right? We struggle to kind of build up and get the labor, and it's very hard to get labor to support operations when there are other stimulus money where they can be compensated very similarly by not working in some of those tough jobs. A warehouse job isn't easy.
Right. In addition to that, just safety. There's a lot of employees who are just not comfortable yet coming back to work. So I think, it's going to be an interesting situation as more money flows into the economy to see how this dynamic changes. Hopefully, through the vaccinations, there'll be, that fear factor will be reduced, and we'll start seeing a lot more people coming back to work.
Yeah, certainly the labor side, that fear factor, we saw those impacts in the marketplace. But Wes, back to the kind of roots of your question, and there was a lot packed in there. And like Bart, I'm not going to touch some of that. I think Andy did nicely around it. Well done, Andy. But I would tell you that I think our educational system, we're just beginning to refocus on what that should look like. Pushing back into the high schools, some programs that would maybe unstigmatize the manufacturing and you know, opportunities that exist for value creation in our economy. I think that's an area that, you know, we'd like to see more of. I would offer, just as a, you know, a pundit for education, just a better sense of the opportunities that exist in the manufacturing, you know, distribution and supply chain world. I think it's an area that got neglected through our educational process and maybe unglamorized, and maybe we can re-glamorize it a little bit. So that's one of the things we're trying to do locally here in Chicago, through the various extension programs and other things like you have there in Ohio, is driving it back into the high schools and getting more of those folks a real understanding of how there can be some very high value-added opportunities for individuals to contribute through these different areas in our manufacturing world. So that'd be my big one, Wes. I don't know, but I think we've covered most of it.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Another question that we have is, you know, consumer sentiment seems to be pushing for transparency. They want to know where something is sourced. How important do you guys see transparency, and are your clients and Andy as Romark starting to look at that as a critical decision in the decision-making process regarding supply chain?
Wes, why don't I start and let Andy think about that for a second. I touched on it with that tier N visibility. There's a couple reasons why folks are really focusing on the tier N visibility. One is a compliance standpoint. Really, it's that traceability of down to raw materials. Are there conflict minerals at play? Things like that. So, you know, that would be one reason. And yes, people do, you know, society is wanting more transparency into what makes up a given product or service. So, you know, from the consumer standpoint, that's absolutely happening. That tier N visibility, as I mentioned before, though, is, you know, one lower level supplier can impact multiple higher level suppliers and ultimately OEMs. So understanding that connectivity and those touch points is also really important. I think there's multiple angles, but certainly the consumer angle is definitely one to focus on. It's just not an easy problem to solve.
Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. And we deal with, you know, both B2B and B2C, right? So we have, you know, customers that buy very small, you know, hundreds of dollars a year. Then we have some very, very large customers, right? And it's typically the very large customers where they're really trying to get farther down the supply chain and understand, you know, some of those issues and concerns that they have, whether it's conflict minerals, fair labor standards, you know, those types of things that, I'll be honest, at larger companies, we had teams that focused on those because we had, you know, the automotive guys, you know, they expected to know. So we're starting to see some of those questions or issues raised as far as smaller customers, and that's probably an area we need to improve, and, you know, a little better visibility down the supply chain on where some squishy spots might be.
No, I think that's well said, Andy. I think certainly, you know, visibility and transparency. So we're seeing it in our foods, right? The farm to table and understanding traceability, it's coming from that. Walmart's pushed that into their supply chain for all, you know, produce. I think you're going to see that extended, and I think you're going to see it extended. As Andy talked about, automotive has been doing it, you know, reliability and traceability back to the source on material supply, especially for critical components. That's been out there for a long time, and we've had teams focused on it for a long time. But I think it's, how do we take friction out of that? And that's where Bart talked a little bit about the opportunities to leverage technology, AI, and some other things to start to streamline. Blockchain certainly is a driver in that, to take friction out of the system and make the transparency better, and also reduce the cost of getting to that transparency. So we're seeing it. I think it's a trend that's not going to abate. And, you know, I think the sooner you can get thinking about how you can make that work for you, it's going to pay off in the long run. So that's a great question, Wes.
Good. Got another one. Over the course of 2020, we saw a huge amount of ports being at or near capacity. This has caused significant delays with imports, chassis constraints, and much higher monetary costs to handle international logistics. What have your companies done to reduce the impact of these concerns and incorporate the adjustment of these expectations into your company?
Well, there's a lot of firefighting going on right now. I hear stories about some companies, chartering jets to fly back and forth from Asia on a weekly basis. That's not necessarily sustainable. In reality, there's not a lot that can be done other than trying to expedite. You need that visibility up front so that you can work with your partners to try to work around the situation. So a lot of the focus is trying to better plan to avoid these situations in the future. That gets back to conversations around dual sourcing, higher inventory levels. I've got one client right now that we're helping get to much more of a statistically driven safety stock, but in the interim, we're just going to get 2 months worth of raw materials just to have the buffer. Toyota, as I mentioned, had bought 10 months worth of microchips. So they anticipated that. So when you're in the situation and your containers are in a queue out in LA waiting to get into Long Beach, there's not a hell of a lot you can do about it. It's about trying to have that more resilient supply chain up front and thinking about those things and better preparing in the future. I wish I had a better answer, Frank.
Yeah, Andy, what's your reaction? You're living it every day, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's challenges, throughout the entire supply chain. So if we can get the manufacturers in Asia to produce the product, it's getting a truck to be able to pick it up and then the whole way here, right? So now there are some things we have been able to do with some of our forwarders as far as, some priority booking, right? There's a little extra service fee that you can pay to, kind of get priority booking on the plane. It's not guaranteed you're going to get in first class, but you have a better shot for those really critical shipments. And we do have to prioritize some of those ones where there's, higher margins or higher customer demand. And we can't do it for every shipment, but we also can't afford to put it on a plane in the most cases. So we do try to upgrade some of the service levels with the priority service. No guarantees, but it does help us to put to the front of the line. And now it doesn't help on this side of the states when it sits in Long Beach for how many weeks off the coast waiting to dock. But it's a daily struggle. But communication is key, and with your sales teams and kind of explaining them so that they can educate the customers. Hey, it's imminent. It's on the water. It's at the port. It's on land. It's every step you get closer, we have a higher degree of confidence we're going to see it sooner than later.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. Right now it's challenging a lot of people, Wes. There is no answer to Bart's point. And I would tell you this is for our audience. This is going to last, our estimation, and Andy, I'd be interested in your perspective, but my view and the view that Bart and some of our other team members have shared is we're at least through the third quarter with this constraint, at least. We're going to see workforce come back. And so the bottleneck on labor in the port is alleviating. Now it's just a log jam and space constraint of the containers and getting it in and out. The other thing is we are seeing as a result significantly increased cost for freight for those shipments. So nothing we can do other than react and try and get out in front of that from a cost and a price perspective. And unfortunately, it is having an impact on service levels. And there's just, as Andy stated, not much you can do other than just do your best to communicate. So I wish we all had a better answer to that.
Yeah, no, that's good information though. Another good question I can relate to, another probably loaded question, but what does this mean for the end consumer, right? So we're talking about all the challenges, talking about some opportunities. It all seems very costly. So, as somebody that, bought a $3 roll of toilet paper during the pandemic, is this our future? Should we all get ready to just pay more than what we really want for products? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Andy, you want to start or you want me to jump in? Why don't you go and then I'll jump in after.
Short term, it's definitely an increase in cost, right? We're seeing tariff issues and freight issues and labor. There's just short term, it's definitely an increase in cost. I think I'll be curious to see longer term what's going to happen once it balances out, right? Is this here to stay, or companies going to use this as an opportunity to raise margins or kind of get back to where they were before? But I think in the short term, we're trying to absorb it and minimize that cost for the customer, but eventually it'll have to balance out, I'm sure, but I'll let you guys. talk to that.
Well, I think we have an economist, Bart. I don't know if you want to talk about it. We've got a great economist at RSM. I guess he would tell you that the growth is good. I think we are going to continue to see price pressures. And everybody's got a different view on that. So I think price pressure is going to continue short term. I think we need to see more and more of our workforce get back to work. I think we will see that with the alleviation and extension of the vaccinations. That's going to help huge in some of the choke points that are happening in the economy. I think broadly speaking, we're in for another year of really good growth. I think it was a K-shaped recovery last year. I think we're going to see that moving more towards that, the V that we were hoping everyone would be participating in for the remainder of the year. But I can't help personally, this is a David Cohn comment, I can't help personally not expect to see some inflation. I think we're going to see more than what the economists are predicting, mainly because I think supply is going to damp that a bit because we won't be able to get the supply we need. That's going to drive prices higher. I think if you're in in a market where your product is pretty insulated from the demand, you might be okay. If you're very price sensitive, you may lose out because people just won't pay the extra money for that product if there's another alternative. So I don't know, Bart, anything you'd augment there real quick?
Yeah, just I think there's pent up demand, to complicate the situation. So once people do get out there and start spending more, that's given the supply shortages, it's only going to compound the situation. So I do expect to see inflation in the not too distant future, but I think we're in for a good year as David was suggesting.
Great. Well, I think that's the time we have. Really appreciate our presenters here. We really appreciate and value our alliance that we have with RSM. We appreciate David, Bart, you guys taking some time to do this, and then Andy at Romark, another valued relationship. We really appreciate you taking the time. I know you definitely said you've got a lot going on these days, which based on this presentation makes a lot of sense. We'd like to also thank our presenters and the sponsors, I should say, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and SIFT. Thank you to them. And thank you to our team here at GJM, Kelly and Susan. It's a lot of work putting these on, and so appreciate your guys' help. And lastly, remember, if you want CPE, to make sure you email us at info@gjmltd.com. Thanks a lot. Have a great day and a great weekend.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks,
Everybody.
everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Have a great day.